Yes, thank you very much, Kim, for introducing. I'm going to talk about, as Kim said, feminist critical theory and anti-Semitism after 7 October. And as I said before, it's very much about reactions to the 7 October attacks within the academia, more particularly in a certain part of academia, namely current forms of critical theory. It is indeed deplorable to witness how people who were renowned in feminist critical theory, how they transform from critical thinkers into anti-Israel activists. So decades ago, the struggle to analyze and criticize anti-Semitism was a core moment of critical theory. And yet Horkheimer and Adorno understood anti-Semitism as the most important ideology in bourgeois society, one with which modern society legitimized itself and veiled the social contradictions of freedom of the individual on the one hand and unfreedom due to class relations on the other hand. So we can say that Adorno's entire sociological and philosophical thought after the Shoah revolved sometimes explicitly, sometimes more implicitly around coming to terms with and combating anti-Semitism. This found expression in numerous writings, in numerous articles and texts and books and whatsoever. And one of the most famous passages, of course, is the new categorical imperative that Adorno gave in the Negative Dialectics. Let me quote briefly. A new categorical imperative has been imposed by Hitler upon unfree mankind to arrange their thoughts and actions so that Auschwitz will not repeat itself, so that nothing similar will happen. End of quote from Negative Dialectics. So what does the categorical imperative mean? The categorical imperative commands all rational beings to examine and judge their actions to see if they conform to the maxim which is universally and always valid as long as conditions remain unchanged, meaning as long as mankind remains unfree. And to an unfree mankind belongs intrinsically anti-Semitism. So as long as there is anti-Semitism, the Jewish state of Israel as a potential refuge for all Jews worldwide reduces the risk that something similar to Nazi violence against the Jews could happen again. So for Adorno and Horkheimer, but also for Marcuse, Israel's existence was unconditional, and they were in favor of a strong IDF, even though they criticized some of Israel's policies. So against that background, I would like to focus on those forms of critical theory that have abandoned the focus on anti-Semitism critique to such an extent that after 7 October, a rigid and a one-sided Palestine solidarity is propagated, one that eventually legitimizes the Hamas massacres as an act of resistance, and Israel thereby is falsely demonized as apartheid and delegitimized as settler colonial state. On the other hand, solidarity with Israeli victims of the anti-Semitic murders and misogynistic sexual violence is often relegated to the background if it exists at all. So immediately after, or no, couple of weeks after 7 October, the Austrian writer Doron Rabinovich spoke of, I quote, a process of derealization. What happened to the victims is not recognized. This is the second erasure of their existence, end of quote. And Adorno had referred to the realization of victims as a major mechanism in secondary anti-Semitism after the Shoah. And after 10/7, derealization took place in various ways. Judith Butler, for example, wrote in a text entitled The Compass of Mourning, immediately after 10/7, that they felt sick for days and at the sight of Hamas's violence, and that violence should be rejected. Oh, this is really loud now. Maybe we could close the window, sorry. Thank you. So after 10/7, she wrote, Judith Butler wrote that they felt sick for days at the sight of Hamas's violence, but that one should not remain in an, I quote, anti-intellectual and presentist position of moral outrage, end of quote. They called for Hamas violence to be contextualized within a continuum of violence and counter-violence, for which Butler eventually blamed Israel as a settler colonial state. Hamas's anti-Semitism remained unmentioned throughout the whole text. In the months that followed, Butler pushed the distortion of perception and the derealization of Israeli victims even further, to the point of openly doubting the rape of Israeli women by Hamas in March 2024. By then, there was really clear evidence. They wanted to see clear evidence, however, which not only stands in stark contrast to the otherwise widely accepted feminist demand to believe the women, but also ignores the fact that the rapes committed by Hamas are among the most documented crimes in history. The pictures of apparently raped women were distributed by the perpetrators themselves on 7 October. At the same event in Paris, Butler also denied the anti-Semitic nature of the attack and said that it was not an attack on Israelis, thereby declaring, that it was an attack on Israelis, it was not an attack on Jews, thereby declaring irrelevant both the Jewish identity of the majority of those attacked and the anti-Semitic ideology of the Hamas. This anti-Semitic ideology is, of course, well documented in Hamas's own charter. And this anti-Semitism is therefore the essential context of the 7 October attack. Even though criticism of Israel's settlement policy in the West Bank is necessary and active and actually massively voiced in Israel itself, this does not change anything in the anti-Semitic ideology of and exterminationist intentions of Hamas. This is also evidenced in the fact that Hamas attacked left-wing Israelis who were actually prone to find peace with the Palestinians. So anti-Semitism is not a consequence of the Middle East conflict, as José Brunner pointed out, but one of its main causes. And the Israeli feminist critical theorist Eva Illouz put it succinctly, let me quote, "The fact that Judith Butler was born Jewish and a woman should not prevent us from recognizing two forms of denial here. The denial of the slaughter of women and the denial of the slaughter of Jews," end of quote. So with the blurring of the meaning of anti-Semitism comes an incredible ignorance of the whole issue of the Middle East conflict. Nancy Fraser, she is a world prominent feminist critical theorist. She was one of the original signatories of an open letter called Philosophy for Palestine. And this letter failed to condemn Hamas's massacre, blamed Israel as apartheid, and called for cultural and academic boycott of Israelis. When asked from where philosophers get their knowledge of injustice, she answered that philosophers had no special expertise, but spoke as citizens. And that implies that one does not need to know much about anti-Semitism and the history of the Middle East conflict, and also not about Hamas's genocidal anti-Semitic charter, to make a clear anti-Israel judgment. Palestine solidarity thus runs the risk of becoming a slogan of anti-Western self-righteousness that is only superficially concerned with the freedom and security of Palestinians. It is definitely not concerned with the terror of Hamas against the Palestinians. So Palestinians are recognized as victims only in regard of Israel. In response to philosophy of for Palestine, Sheila Ben Habib, another very prominent feminist critical theorist, demanded historical facts about the Middle East conflict against the simplistic and ideologically distorted view of philosophy for Palestine. She pointed out the nihilism of Hamas, using the Palestinian civilian population as a shield. And at this point, Nancy Fraser said that she was disappointed with her old friend and colleague. So while Adorno and Else Franke-Brunswick and other critical theorists had engaged in thorough empirical and theoretical analysis of anti-Semitism, anti-feminism, nationalism, and so on, before they built a judgment, this seems to be abandoned by philosophers for Palestine. But we also had already yesterday the question, when did that all start? And that started well before 10/7. Ignoring anti-Semitism critique within critical theory is not new, and sometimes that ignorance went hand in hand with legitimizations of radical Islamism. As early as 2006, in a discussion at the UC Berkeley, Judith Butler described the Islamo-fascist terrorist organizations Hamas and Hezbollah as progressive social movements that should be recognized as part of the global left. And another pioneer of an alliance between the left and Islamism was Susan Buck-Morss, another critical feminist theorist. In her book, Thinking Past Terror, first published in 2003, written immediately after the experience of 9/11, she wrote in the preface, I quote, "The book's central proposal is that Islamism as a political discourse can be considered together with critical theory as critiques of modernity in its Western developed form." End of quote. So after 9/11, Buck-Morss saw the Western critique of modernity in crisis and hoped for support from Islamists. And she referred not to any Islamist, she referred to Said Qutb, the mastermind of the anti-Semitic Muslim Brotherhood and located parallels between the Muslim Brotherhood and critical theory. And this comparison is, of course, appalling and completely inadequate, because Said Qutb's and the Muslim Brotherhood's thrust sought to purify Islamic society of everything allegedly un-Islamic, and through the enforcement of a particularly repressive interpretation of Sharia law. It is an anti-modern critique of modernity that longed for a pure Islamic primeval state. Similarly, Hitler longed for an eradication of all modern mediation. And indeed, there is that connecting point between Said Qutb and the Nazis. What is it? It is the anti-Semitism. So to mention Qutb in the same breath as Horkheimer and Adorno is to completely ignore Qutb's rabid anti-Semitism. And let me give you just a small taste of the intensity of his anti-Semitism. In his propaganda text, Our Struggle with the Jews from 1950, he created crude anti-Semitic conspiracy myths about Jews doing evil and about Allah sending the Muslims and Hitler to save the world from the Jews. The Jews are accused of being behind all those things that Qutb finds despicable. Let me quote, "Behind the doctrine of atheistic materialism was a Jew. Behind the doctrine of animalistic sexuality was a Jew. And behind the destruction of the family and the shattering of sacred relationships in society was a Jew." End of quote, Said Qutb. And this quote highlights the strong connection between anti-Semitism, anti-feminism, and ideologies connected to sexual self-determination. And this connection is so prominent in Islamism. And consequently, the left Islamist alliance called for by Buck-Morss, but also by Butler, requires not only the denial of anti-Semitism, but also the denial of anti-feminism. And this is done by framing autonomy in post-colonial contexts as autonomy from, quote, West toxification. And freedom is labeled as freedom, as liberation from Western hegemony. Buck-Morss demands explicitly the recognition of non-Western, extremely patriarchal gender relations, since they are allegedly a critique of Western commodification of female bodies. And similarly, Butler viewed the Islamic burqa as, I quote, an exercise in modesty and pride behind and through which female agency can operate, end of quote. And now compare this with what Ali Khamenei, the spiritual leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, said in terms of gender justice, I quote, designating women as goods and means of pleasure in Western world most probably is among Zionists' plots to destroy human community. So here you see in what way the anti-feminism and the anti-Semitism between the Islamism and the particular strand of theory in the West is connected. What Buck-Morss and Butler are doing actually is reducing Western freedom for women to consumption and commodification of female bodies, from which non-Western women must be protected. What Butler and Buck-Morss fail to mention, however, is that for both of them, Western freedom has so much more to offer, not least democratic participation, equal and individual rights, and sexual self-determination. So I think that such cultural relativistic views goes hand in hand with the erosion of universally binding concepts. And the void of binding concepts, we observe this with the genocide, talk that is being done at the moment, and this is also evident in the debates on 7 October. Without a well-founded concept of anti-Semitism, I would say, its content and meaning are lost, and it is not recognized as an essential context of what was going on and what is going on. It is therefore necessary, I would say, to continue updating the critical theory of anti-Semitism and to take an empirical look at how its most current forms manifest itself in rabid hatred of Israel. This is currently, as I already said, the most effective anti-Semitic ideology of integration. And I also think it's necessary to strengthen a critical judgment of anti-Semitism that recognizes anti-Semitism as an intersectional ideology, because we see that anti-Semitism intersects so strongly with homophobia, with anti-feminism, with sexism. And I think that we can only really understand it. We can understand the motivation that's behind it only if we see it in that constellations. And I think that the studies in the authoritarian personality carried out in the US in the 1940s by Adorno, Elsa Frankel, Brunswick, and others can be helpful in this. Because one of its most important discoveries was that ideologies such as anti-Semitism, racism, sexism, and homophobia, ethnocentrism, nationalism, and so on, and also the legitimation of class inequality, that all those ideologies rarely occur in as isolated phenomena, but that they develop within a broader framework, and this broader framework is called the authoritarian ideological syndrome. So I would say, building on this, I would say that ideologies are certainly intersectional, that they permeate and reinforce each other, and that anti-Semitism appears as a master ideology in this sense, and in the sense that it entails a whole worldview. It's not just a prejudice against one particular group. It is a whole worldview. And while being a whole worldview, it operates with moments that are sexist, with moments that are homophobic, nationalistic, but also nationalistic, like, like a wrongly universalized anti-nationalism. So thus, anti-Semitism itself is the intersectional ideology. How much time do I have? I have it? Great. So because I want to give an example. Great. Because I want to give an example how I see this anti-Semitism as an intersectional ideology. Hamas's ideology. In this ideology, the well-being of the world depends on the annihilation of Jews and on extreme misogyny. The same is true for the ideology of the Mullah regime in Iran. It is not, we cannot think of an Islamic Republic of Iran that recognizes the state of Israel, and as well, we cannot think of an Islamic Republic of Iran giving up the gender apartheid. So these are really two columns of this Islamist ideology. And this also showed in Hamas's anti-Semitic rapes as a manifestation of threefold hatred, as Rolf Pohl called it. The victim is Israeli, which is hatred of the state. She is Jewish, which is anti-Semitism. And thirdly, the victim is a woman, which is misogyny. And it was no coincidence that Hamas attacked a music festival where young, left, secular, and sexually free Israelis were celebrating. They stand for modern life. They stand for freedom and equality, however contradictory that may be, and however damaged that may be. But the Islamists all hate all that. And the fusion of sexuality, of cults, of masculinity, and a nihilistic worship of death is a central socio-psychological pattern in sexism, anti-feminism, homophobia, and transphobia. And it's interesting that Judith Butler herself pointed to that very nihilism and that very death, that very worship of death, and criticized it. But she never did that with regard to Islamism. So these ideologies regularly act as a hinge to anti-Semitism. Hamas's hatred of a certain image of the West targets individual freedom, sexual self-determination, gender equality, and the desire and striving for emancipation and happiness. And this hatred is equally expressed in the murder of Jews and the murder of emancipated women, since both Jews and emancipated women stand for these hated ideals of freedom and happiness. So in anti-Semitism and anti-feminism, the desire for freedom and emancipation itself is eradicated. And this is a desire the Islamists may have themselves, but which they don't allow. In jihadist Islamism, anti-Semitism, gender apartheid, and the devastating hatred of LGBTIQ people are directly linked. So, and I think that an intersectional ideology critique can make this evident. So, an intersectional ideology critique, and with this I come to my final remarks, can serve as a starting point for a feminist critical theory that does not idealize patriarchal Islamic gender relations in a cultural relativistic manner, and which does also not ignore the anti-Semitism of Hamas, nor the horror that Palestinians are going through. We need a feminist critical theory that is a truly intersectional one, so that anti-racism, anti-sexism, and the fight against anti-Semitism are no longer played off against each other. And this would be an important signal, I think, both for the Israeli victims of Hamas terror and for Palestinians who want to live free from Islamofascist terror. Thank you very much.